Thanks for coming along, and thanks to everybody that's here for braving the cold today. Thanks to everybody who's tuning in from afar. So for the next wee while, I will look at some of the ways that archive images can be used in connection with Scottish brickwork. My record for a talk about bricks is 5 days. So if you think, wow, he's going on a bit, you're the lucky ones. So I could talk for days and days and days about this. So when I was invited to talk about bricks and archival images, I thought, right, what different ways can we use archive images to inform our approach to Scottish brickwork? And that's the list I came up with. So we can explore the development of brick making in Scotland, and that will be the first section of the talk today. We can also use archival images to identify how brick has been used, how brick structures have developed over time. Unfortunately, we can see what we've lost in terms of Scottish brickwork, because we have regrettably lost some very fine brick buildings. But we can also take from that, right, well, we've lost all of this, and this is left, so wait a minute, we better just look after that and make sure it's preserved. We can also understand how buildings have developed over time. So the second part of the talk today will look at this sort of area. Right, so brick making in Scotland. How has that developed historically? Well, the Romans came and they made some bricks and then they left, and that was that. So we'll sort of park the Romans. We won't really talk about them, but we should acknowledge that they did make some bricks before they went away. It's not until the 17th century that we see brick making re-emerge in Scotland on a very small number of sites. And then in the 18th century, we start to see brickworks popping up all over the place. Brick begins to be used in a much more widespread way in the 18th century. The 19th century sees industrialization and mechanization of the brick-making process, and we'll go on to explore that in a minute. 20th century, we've got a pretty significant brick industry. Later 20th century into the 21st century, we see the industry almost vanish, to the point that there's only one brickworks left in Scotland. So to explore that through images, in the 18th century, there were some permanent brickworks established, but we also see a lot of manufacturing on the site of buildings which are being constructed. So some examples of that: Inveraray, both the castle and the town, had a temporary brickwork established for 5 or 6 years. It produced bricks for Inveraray Castle, it produced bricks for the town as well, and then it went away. Fort George, we'll see a picture of that later on, another example of on-site production. So what was happening there was brick makers were being brought up from England, and they were told to establish a brickwork for a given period of time. This image here is, I can't help but feel a little bit of an idealized version of what a temporary brick field would have looked like, but you get the broad idea. So they've been brought up from England for a period of time, they've made some bricks, and then they've gone away. Now, these early brickworks, so think 18th century brickworks, think earlier part of the 19th century, they were fairly basic. So they would extract clay from a hillside. So you can see it in this image here. This is a brickworks near Montrose. They would extract clay, fairly shallow pits in the hillside. They would take it to the moulding shed. The bricks would be moulded. That's how they were made. So we can see from archival images, we can glean details like that. In this image, as you can probably tell, it's not 18th century, it's not 19th century. It is actually about the middle of the 20th century. And small-scale brickmaking like this carried on probably up until the 70s or 80s. Now, In the 18th and into the 19th century, bricks were made by hand, and that's what you can see from this image here. The hand moulding process for brickmaking. So you would get a boy, usually a child, would bring some clay to the moulder, which is the fellow that you can see with a lump of clay in his hand, and he would get the lump of clay and he'd hold it on his head and he would dash it into the mould. And that's what he did all day long. This guy was supplied with clay and he would just bash it into the mould, strike the excess clay off the top. The clay would then be taken, the bricks would be taken away, it would be dried, and then it would be fired in a kiln. Very, very hard work. I had a go at that, and I had one and I thought, hey, that's no hassle. I had another one, I was a bit tired. I had another one, I was knackered, that was it. So, very hard work indeed. And that's basically all this fellow did all day long. Now, hand moulding of bricks is still practiced today, so you can still buy handmade bricks made out of England. It's carried on in Scotland well into the 20th century. So this is a refractory brick, so a brick designed to line furnaces, and that's it being hand moulded in the 1950s near Falkirk. Now, some numbers. Even before we mechanised the brickmaking process in Scotland, in 1802, we made 15.25 million bricks in Scotland. So, that's a substantial number. In 1840, we made nearly 50 million bricks, and they were all made by hand because mechanisation doesn't come in until slightly later. What this means is that basically 50 million times somebody in Scotland got a lump of clay and dashed it into a mould and moulded a brick. So there's a lot of human effort went into making bricks in Scotland. So when we're looking at brick buildings, we need to also appreciate the effort that went into making the bricks themselves. 1843, very significant date in brickmaking history, because that's the year that the Tweeddale patent brick and tile machine was invented. And these drawings here are from around the time that it was invented. Now, people are always telling me, historic Scotland, why are you looking at bricks? Bricks aren't Scottish. Well, you would be wrong. You'd be entirely wrong, because this machine was invented in Scotland, and it was the world's first commercially successful mechanised process for moulding bricks. So next time somebody tells you that bricks aren't Scottish, you can point them in the direction of the Tweeddale brick and tile machine. Now, once you've moulded the bricks, you have to fire them. And in the early days of brickmaking in Scotland, they were fired in fairly small kilns. I could talk for a long time about kilns, but I must not go off on a tangent. Early days were fired in fairly small kilns. These kilns worked on the principle that you'd load them with bricks, you'd fire them up, you'd let them cool down, you'd take the bricks out, and then you'd start the process again. They were called intermittent kilns because you'd fire them, cool them, and that's that. The more advanced version of a kiln is a continuous kiln. Now, a continuous kiln has a series of chambers. You load one, you fire it, but in this chamber here, you've got other bricks, and they're getting dried by the heat from this one. And the process goes round in a circle until you end up back at the original firing chamber. Now, everybody knows that continuous kilns were invented by Hoffman in Germany. No, wrong, entirely wrong. Continuous kilns were also invented in Scotland. The first commercially successful continuous kiln was the Ainsley kiln, and he invented it in Scotland. And he then went down to London, where there was a lot more brickmaking, and made a whole load of money. But again, a very significant development which took place here. So that's something else to tell people that say that bricks aren't Scottish. Now, when we think about the mechanisation of brickmaking and we look at images, we can see that the early machines worked with the principle of extrusion. Now, here we have an extrusion machine, and the best way to think of that is if you get a tube of toothpaste and you squeeze the tube, you get a long column of toothpaste that comes out. Extrusion brick-making machines work with the same principle, so they force out a column of clay and then they get chopped up into the requisite size by wires. So that's how early brick-making machines worked. As the 19th century wore on, we got new processes for brick-making. So we got the press type machines that would get the clay and press it into a mold, and we can see a good example of that from the HES Archives. This plastic process, again, I must rein myself in and not go on about this type of thing for too long. Essentially, this involved grinding up clay into a powder, adding a wee bit of water, and then forcing it into a mold. All of these new processes in the 19th century made brickmaking more efficient. They allowed more bricks to be produced, and we see an explosion in the brickmaking industry in Scotland in the latter 19th century. They also allowed new raw materials to be used. Rather than digging a bit of clay out of a hillside, well, wait a minute, we've got all of this waste material from coal mining, big, massive mountains of blaze and shale lying around the place. What if we could crush that up and make bricks out of it? Excellent. Why not? So here we can see material being extracted from one of those big mountains of shale, and that's getting taken away, ground up, and made into bricks. So if you see a building and somebody says, "Oh, that's made of a colliery shale brick," that's where the raw material came from. Mentioned Hoffman kilns a minute ago. These were very successful. These are continuous kilns. Each one of these chambers would be filled with bricks, fired, and in the chamber next door, the bricks would be dried there. We see lots of these being built in Scotland in the later part of the 19th into the 20th century, and they increased production substantially. To the point that by 1900, there were 50 brickworks within Glasgow alone. So that's quite something. They were producing 40 million bricks a year in 1900. So that gives an idea of the scale of brick production just in Glasgow in 1900. Now, we see brick making all throughout the industrialised central belt of Scotland. Lanarkshire, Ayrshire, Fife, Stirlingshire, all had substantial brickworks. But all those other bits of Scotland had brickworks as well, and we mustn't overlook that. So Aberdeenshire, I've said 9 here, it's probably more than that. Angus has quite a few brickworks, Perthshire, Berwickshire, but places you wouldn't expect. Islay had a brick and tile works, and that's where this picture comes from. So this is the pug mill that processed the clay, and that's the Foreman brick and tile works on Islay, which you can still see bits of if you're there. And yeah, it's sort of hard to find a wee glimpse of it from the road, and you slam on the brakes, and then you're like, "Oh, I know what that is," and then you get out of the car and cause a traffic jam. Anyway, you can still see bits of it. Skye had a brickworks, Bute had a substantial brickworks at one time. So we mustn't overlook the sort of wider spread of brickworks. Orkney and Shetland don't seem to have had any brickworks, but everywhere else did. Also, just in my quick tour of brick making history, need to mention refractory bricks. So refractory brick is a brick which withstands heat and was used to line furnaces for iron works and glass works and all those things like that. This is Castle Carey, where there was a substantial refractory brickworks. Places like Glenboig in Lanarkshire as well, Dunkirk, they all had substantial refractory brickworks. These were the best refractory bricks in the world. So we often talk about South Scotland exported ironwork all over the place and materials like that. But without refractory bricks, you don't have any ironwork. And we exported millions of refractory bricks all over the world. Today, though, sadly, there's only one brick making firm left in Scotland. They only have one brickworks. So the sort of sort of sad image that we can see here is the Errol Brickworks, which is now a crisp factory. And no matter how good their crisps are, I just can't bring myself to eat them. But that's the Errol Brickworks, which is sadly no more. So we've almost lost all brick making in Scotland, which is a real shame, and it's why we need to appreciate now through archival images and other evidence what we have left. So that was a quick run through brick making, and hopefully I didn't run on too much of that. Now I want to think about brick buildings in Scotland. So here's my one slide summary of how brick buildings has developed. So in the 18th century, the early part of the 18th century, we see brickworks established on estates, and that is to provide bricks for garden walls, ice houses. Sometimes what was called brick ashlar was used. So I mentioned Inveraray Castle earlier. Now, if you stand in front of Inveraray Castle and look at it, you'd think, well, that's made of stone. Everybody can see that. But actually, the walls of Inveraray Castle internally are lined with brick. And that's something that we see quite often. Later in the 18th century, we see industrial buildings. We see more domestic buildings constructed of brick. That carries on into the 19th century. And we see all sorts of any structure you can think of, and we'll look at more of those in a minute. This is the latter part of that's really the 19th century. Latter part of the 19th century, 1860 to about 1890. That's the golden age of brickwork in Scotland, and we'll explore that in a minute. Quite a lot of nice 20th century buildings constructed of brick, but a lot of them were covered in red. So, take a quick archival image tour through some of these. Fort George, probably the best, well, is the best example of 18th century brickwork in Scotland. That little pond there, that's where they dug out the clay to make the bricks. So we had on-site production there. An incredible building, incredible brick vaulting all throughout that structure. Really, definitely the best building of that date we have in Scotland. Now, archival images can be very useful because they can help you find buildings you didn't know about. Now, this is Stratton House up in Montrose. It's, by my reckoning, it's the oldest domestic brick structure in Scotland, built in 1762, but it's hidden away. You wouldn't see it from the road. It's quite hard to find. And I was trawling through Canmore, which was the predecessor of Trove, that was mentioned earlier, and I stumbled across this. And I thought, oh, I need to try and find that. So I found it, tracked it down. I asked the owner nicely, and I got to look around. But that shows that archival images can help flag things that you wouldn't necessarily know about. The Industrial Revolution saw brick used in a much more extensive way. So Stanley Mill up in Perthshire, it's one of our properties. It's the earliest brick-built mill in Scotland. It's wonderful that it survives. This is Holdrush Mill, which has sadly been demolished. It had a very early fireproof floor, so you can see the brick arches here, which formed fireproof construction, and also had brick external walls. The only evidence we have now for this is through archival images. So if you're the kind of fellow that's sitting down trying to chart how brick bond has developed in Scotland over time, then you need images such as this to help fill in the blanks. Filling in blanks with archival images can also be quite building specific. So this building here is the Bain Street Pipe Factory in Glasgow. Built at various times, but the main bit that we can see today was built in 1877. An incredible building. If you're ever through in Glasgow, I would very much recommend going to see this if you like bricks. But it's curious in how it presents itself now, because there's one bit here and one bit there, and there's not really anything much in between. But if you look back at the archive images, you can see that there was once a middle section with a chimney. And this was the kiln. So the kiln for firing the chimneys was in behind this facade, which was latterly the Dixieland Club, which I'm sure was an intriguing place in its day. So archival images can be very helpful in puzzling out perhaps something that's missing. They can also be useful in trying to figure out the context of buildings. So this one here, this is very sad. It makes me sad to see this building. I go and visit it sometimes if I'm in Glasgow because it's so close to being demolished that I don't know, I have to go and see if it has been demolished. It would have been a lovely building in its day, but you know, it's disused, wasteland on all sides of it. That wasn't always the case. So you can use archival images to put it in context, and you can see the building that was next door, which is no longer there, the building that was in behind. So you get an idea of what this building was like in the past. No guarantees that it's still there. I've not been for a few years, but hopefully it is. This was one that came in to me last year, so it's the Glebe Sugar Refinery through in Greenock. Very unusual building. It's the strangest shape. So you can see from this image, this is the Glebe Sugar Refinery here. You can see here it's a very curious shape, and it was plonked in the middle of other buildings, and that's why it is the shape that it is. And this is what it's like today. The reason archival images were useful for this was there was a bit of discussion. There's plans to renovate the building, bring it back into use, which is great. But there was a bit of debate about which bits were original and which bits had been added on. So archival images were really useful for that. So hopefully this one will have a happy future to come. Now, if we think about how brick buildings have developed in Scotland over time, in the 19th century, we see brickwork be used for urban domestic buildings. But very few examples of this in our big towns and cities survive. So that's the Calton area of Glasgow. There was loads of clay there. So the whole area is basically built on 10 feet of excellent brick-making clay. So they would make some bricks and pan tiles, which is another interesting thing here. So the building that we can see here was built in the 1820s. All of this, though, has been lost. So the vast majority, certainly in Glasgow, of these early brick urban buildings have gone. Granton, in Edinburgh, which is what we can see in this picture, is about the only substantial urban area of early 19th century brickwork that we have left. And the reason it survived is because it was of exceptionally high quality. So the example on the left there, a bit rough and ready. The example from Granton, however, very well constructed, very well built, very solid. Wrecking the place. So that's why that survived. But that also informs us in thinking, right, we really need to try and preserve this as far as possible. Now, I'm going to take a detour. I said I could talk for days about bricks in general. I could probably talk for a full day about tall chimneys. But again, I will rein myself in and try and stick to a few minutes. Tall chimneys in the 19th century became a particular specialism within Scottish brickwork. And they were really tall, to use a technical term. Scotland broke the world record for tall chimney construction in 1841 with this monstrous construction here in Glasgow, tenant stock, and it really, I mean, you can see how it dominated the skyline. It was an enormous chimney indeed. So it rose to 435 feet high, 40 feet in diameter at the ground, and it was described thus: a huge monster continually pouring his sooty treasures into the region of the clouds. So very poetic. I like that. Demolished, well, partially collapsed, then it was demolished in 1922. But that was a world record tall chimney. So that's something to be proud of for Scotland. But wait, it doesn't end there, because we actually broke our own record in Scotland. So In 1857, the record was broken again in Glasgow, and this time Townsend stock. It was the tallest in the world again. So, you know, we're doing pretty well. For 42 years in the middle of the 19th century, the tallest chimney in the world was in Glasgow. Now, that is something which I think we should make much more of a big deal about, because the 19th century was basically peak tall chimney construction era. So for us to be able to build something of this stature is something I think we should be more pleased with ourselves about. So there's some statistics around that. 454 feet tall. This deflection is fascinating. Again, we could have a whole hour on the deflection, because what happened with that was there was a big storm and the chimney developed a lean. Now, you would think panic stations, not in Glasgow in the mid-19th century. They sent some folk up, they chopped a wedge-shaped bit of brickwork out of it and let it right itself. No bother, job done. Okay, there you are. It was described as one of the best specimens of substantial, well-made brickwork in existence. So again, when people are telling you bricks aren't Scottish, you can point them to this. Now, some tall chimneys were very decorative. And again, this is something that we don't always appreciate. So this is a mill chimney in Edinburgh, and you can see the polychromatic decoration on that chimney. Bearing in mind, this is an entirely functional structure. I mean, it's as functional as you get, a tall chimney attached to a mill. But they went to considerable effort to add this decorative embellishment. Now, this one is gone. Sadly, almost all the decorative tall chimneys in Scotland are gone, but we do have one left in Dundee. So Cox's Stack in Dundee, you can get some idea of the decorative treatment here. A wee bit more closer in details of it in these pictures. It is an incredible structure. It's unique in terms of survival in Scotland. There's a few in England. I don't think they're as good as this, so I'm probably biased. This is, though, the only one that we have left, and it's in reasonable condition, but who owns it? Nobody really quite knows. So, looked at that a few years ago. It's all a little bit unclear as to who owns it, who's responsible for it. And considering it's the only one left of its kind in Scotland, I think we should be making efforts to try and look after this and celebrate it more. It kind of sits on its own, it's kind of marooned now because all the industrial buildings have been replaced with new development. So an incredible structure. Go and see it if you're in that area of Dundee. Now, I mentioned the Golden Age, 1860 to 1890. I'm probably the only one that refers to it as the Golden Age of Scottish brickwork, but it's incredible. And if we look at these archival images here, we can see some buildings from that date. That's St. Sophia's Church in Galston. Incredible piece of brickwork. So really, really marvellous structure. This is Hayford Mill, just a few miles over that way in Cambusbarron. The attention to detail, the skill of the bricklayers in forming not one, not two, but three different forms of arches in brickwork. All of this detailed polychromatic work. This is Templeton's Carpet Factory, the iconic brick structure in Scotland. You know, again, go and see it if you're in that part of Glasgow. It's incredible. You know, you're on Glasgow Green, you're looking about, and oh, it's the Doge's Palace, because that was the inspiration for this facade. Part of planning conditions. So Templetons were told you can only build a carpet factory in Glasgow Green if it looks incredible. Okay, said the architect, I'll make it look like the Doge's Palace, but I'll make this bit up at the top, I'll use the bricks to pick out a carpet weave pattern. This is a carpet factory. Just incredible stuff. The skill, the confidence that went into this type of brickwork is really outstanding. But it wasn't just in a decorative sense it was a golden age. It was also technically an era in which Scottish bricklayers were absolutely exceptional. So we've seen the tall chimneys, but they also built North Unst lighthouse out of brick. I mean, that's probably the most exposed piece of brickwork in Europe, I'd imagine. The waves sometimes go over the top of it, so that perhaps gives an indication of what it's had to resist. Over 200 years later, still the bricks are still functioning perfectly well. Massive mill structures, bridges, tunnels, all sorts of infrastructure constructed of brick throughout Scotland. North Unst is just one of about 12 lighthouses built of brick around Scotland. So we not only have a confidence in terms of decorative embellishments, we also have the skill and the know-how to construct structures such as this and tall chimneys that really are exceptional. Other more everyday structures constructed of brick around that time include urban tenements. So that's an old image of a brick-built tenement in Glasgow. Again, almost all of these have been lost. There's just a few that survive. And also the extensive use of brick to construct housing for industrial workers. Vast swathes of industrial Scotland were covered in that type of brick housing, most of which has been lost. So Newton Grange, which you can see in the picture there, has survived largely intact. There's other rows here and there, but in terms of appreciating just how many structures that people lived in were built of brick, it's hard now, without referencing archive images, to get a full picture of that. If you look at archival accounts, they were building 1,500 homes at a time out of brick in the latter part of the 19th century. Again, something that we really don't quite appreciate today. We continue to use brick into the 20th century, so some very big substantial structures. So that's up in Aberdeen. It still survives. It's a bit ruined. They might do something with it. It's a little bit up in the air, but a very substantial structure indeed. What you'll notice though from this is that had that been built, say 20 years before, it had been covered in polychromatic decoration. By this time, brick's starting to become a bit more utilitarian again in how it's used, but a very substantial structure. Another substantial 20th century brick structure is the Meadowside Granary, which is this enormous building that you can see there. When it was built, it was the biggest brick structure in Europe. So again, that's giving us a feel for just how significant brick is to Scotland. Sadly now demolished, but as we can see from the picture, we can appreciate its scale from that. We also see other examples of 20th century brickwork. So we've got some churches here. See quite a lot of 20th century brick-built churches. Brick continues to be used for housing in the 20th century, but it's often cement rendered externally. So it's harder to get a feel for the extent to which brick was used for that purpose. Right, there we go. I've got no idea how long I've spoken for, so hopefully it's not too long or too short. But to wrap things up, archival images are exceptionally useful when looking at the history and development of brickwork in Scotland. So they inform loads of guidance. So we've got the HES short guide and the HES informed guide. We've got a few other bits and pieces that I've done over the years. Without archival images, a full and comprehensive understanding of how brick has been used in Scotland would be impossible. So it really is absolutely vital, both on an individual building basis, but also on that appreciation of brickwork as a whole. So it informs lots of work that we do. So to draw everything to a close, Scotland has a long history of both manufacturing brick and building with it, which I don't think we appreciate enough as a country. We look at stone, we look at lime, we look at timber, we look at iron, we look at thatch. We appreciate these materials as being Scottish and part of our Scottish palette of materials. But brick is absolutely central to that. If we neglect the use of brick, then we will lose what we have left. We've lost a lot already. We need to appreciate what we have. We need to look after it. We need to value it in the same way that we do other types of structures. There's loads of resources if you want to explore this further. So there's the things I pointed to earlier. Trove.scot, which was mentioned before, it's got loads of brick stuff. So you can spend many happy hours looking at that. And that's my email address. If anybody wants to give me a shout, if you've got a brick building that you think I've missed, or you want to ask a question or anything like that,